What I would say is that corporations do hold an incredible amount of power, and the very fact that they are able to go to a court and get justice for themselves probably means they do have more power than nature itself. And so one thing I would advocate for as a nature lawyer is that we should allow nature to be represented in court. If you are an advocate for nature and nature law, you would say that justice is incomplete where nature is not represented, where particular aspects of nature are not represented in spaces which affect those parts of nature. So when you are dealing with the pollution in a river and you are meeting with stakeholders who pollute that river, you should have a voice of the river there.
This is the Changing the Narrative podcast. I'm Chris King, and in each episode, I sit down with someone who's actively participated in helping build a different way of running things, be it an economy, an organization, or community. The aim is to understand how these alternatives to the dominant systems can work in practice, not just the theory of it, but the reality on the ground. In many parts of the world, the law treats a company as a person. It can own property, sign contracts, employ people, and take you to court, or be taken to court itself. The river can't do any of those things. Neither can a woodland, or a wetland, or the soil a business quietly depends on. In most legal systems, the natural world still has almost no voice of its own. My guest this week has spent years trying to change that. Brontie Ansell is a corporate solicitor and the managing director of Lawyers for Nature, a UK-based group of solicitors, barristers and academics who take on no human clients at all because they treat nature itself as their client. Their work runs across the courts, government policy and the fine print of company law, all of it turning on one deceptively simple idea, that nature should have a voice in the rooms where decisions about it are made. One of the most striking places they've taken that idea is inside the boardroom. Brontie sat on the boards of two companies, Faith in Nature and the House of Hackney, as a nature director, speaking for the living world in rooms usually built around shareholder value. And one of the surprising things she'll tell you is that the work rarely looks dramatic. There's no showdown, no confrontation across the table. It happens quietly over months of ordinary conversation. We get into what a nature director actually does and why company law, of all things, turns out to have so much room in it to nurture a different story and approach to how businesses operate and engage with nature. We get into why they give their methods away for free rather than guarding them, and we get into the more ambitious frontier, what it might take for the law itself to let a river speak. A quick note before we start. This conversation opens with how Brontie came to this work, and normally that more personal, foundational part of an episode is something I keep for Changing the Narrative's paying members. This week, it's too central for everything that follows to hold back, so I'm including it for everyone. Here's Brontie. Enjoy. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and the work that you do, that'd be great.
Hi, I'm Brontie. I'm the Managing Director at Lawyers for Nature, and we do work that seeks to protect the natural world. We do a lot of nature-related governance work. I tend to also run the show, if you like, so that leaves me with a bit less time to do legal work than everyone else.
And what was the realization that made you see company law, of all things, as a way to speak for the natural world?
Yeah, it's not the most interesting, is it? I say that as a corporate solicitor. Interestingly, I think that the vast majority of the public believe in some way that corporations are quite heavily regulated, or at least there's a perception that there is quite a bit of law surrounding what corporations can and can't do. And actually, I was an academic for a very long time at various universities, and I taught the kind of philosophy of corporations and the philosophy behind having things like separate legal personality for a corporation. And when I was teaching a critical analysis perspective of corporations, you very quickly realize that actually it really is still quite the Wild West. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's quite a lot of paperwork to fill in. You've got a regulator, and they're not a hands-off regulator. You know, the way companies are regulated in this country, and particularly if you're in the charitable sector, it's very heavily regulated. But I think what people don't realise is there's quite a lot of white space in the photograph. You know, there's quite a lot of places in which you can draw a new story and you can tell a new tale. And I think it was all those years spent lecturing it saying, doing lots of lectures saying, actually, you could do this and actually you can do that and no one can stop you. And you are a separate legal person as a company. That made me realize there's a lot that nobody could stop you from doing. Whereas when you think about top-down approaches from governments move incredibly slowly.
Mhm.
And weirdly, governments exist in a paradox where they move incredibly slowly, but at the same time they have to move incredibly fast because they're sorry, I can't speak. You'll have to cut that bit out.
Yes.
Because they're in an electoral cycle. They've only got 4 years to prove themselves. So lots gets ignored and lots of other things go really fast. So there's a really weird paradox with governments where they can ignore corporations for a really long time and not do anything with them, right? And corporations just get on with it. I think the other thing to say about corporations is nobody cares. There's an incredible apathy about corporations in that what I mean by that is if you pay your debts as they fall due, if your employees are all paid, not even well, but just paid, your taxes are paid on time. Not even if you're paying a dividend. I mean, there's lots of corporations out there that don't pay dividends, right? They're just, they are returning something somewhere. Everybody just leaves you alone. So the landscape is, as long as you pay your debts as they fall due, generally speaking, you just get on with it. So that, for me, was actually quite an exciting landscape to work in, and that's where a lot of our work is done, because corporations are incredibly powerful. And so if we can change how corporations behave, and if we can deal with the really difficult aspects of capitalism, then actually there's a lot of work that we can do, a very healthy amount of work we can do there for the planet.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, that's quite a revelation that there's so much white space, as you say. And having been exposed to that then and seeing that, would it be true to say that the likes of a company, because they are able to be represented as if they were a person, that they actually have more rights than nature currently within the legal system?
Yeah, so that's a complicated answer to that. Depends how long you've got. So rights are not just one thing. First of all, there are concepts of what rights might mean throughout the world, and they're not all the same. So the first thing to say is the way the English legal system, which obviously has been exported, we won't get into that, but it's obviously been exported all over the world.
Mhm.
The way the English legal system views rights is that the system says you have a rights holder and you have a rights upholder. And so in terms of humans, it's quite an easy equation to understand. You can see that a human has the right to live, the right to have an education, the right to practice their religion. And you can see the state should be doing things to make sure that those rights are upheld. So most places it's a super easy equation. And then you just factor in, when you have clashes between citizens or clashes in some other way, how are we going to deal with that? So you have a framework for that. When we translate that information to corporations, it's a little bit trickier to understand or to be able to answer your question, which is, do corporations have more rights than nature? Corporations definitely have legal personhood, so they can sign contracts, for example. They can hold intellectual property in their own name. They can employ people. They pay tax. They can be sued if they don't pay their debts, for example, or they do something like breach a contract or commit a tortious act and incur tortious liability. And it is not the people working in the corporation that get sued in the main. Obviously, there's a very small exception to that with the directors. It is this nebulous thing we call the corporation. So corporations definitely have what we would largely call procedural rights. They have the right to sue and be sued, but they don't necessarily have the right to life, for example, in the same way that a human being would. So a state, if it so chooses, and it sees a corporation doing really awful things and being quite evil, a state could pass a law at parliamentary level that says we're going to kill the corporation dead. or we're going to subsume this particular interest, such as water or railways, into the public space and make it a public corporation. And no one would take to the streets about that. Well, most people wouldn't take to the streets about that. They wouldn't see the corporation as being murdered by the state. And so it's a difficult conversation to effectively simply transplant human rights into a corporation and say, a corporation has more rights than a human being, which would then lead you to the conclusion that it's also very difficult to do that for nature as well. However, what I would say is that corporations do hold an incredible amount of power, and the very fact that they are able to go to a court and get justice for themselves probably means they do have more power than nature itself. And so one thing I would advocate for as a nature lawyer within nature law is that we should allow nature to be represented in court. It's quite a simple thing. We do it already with corporations. We do it with children. We do it with people who are incarcerated and if for whatever reason or sectioned. We give them a guardian, and we even give the guardian its own solicitor as well, and its own barrister. And those interests are represented because we understand that, for example, children, we understand that the child's interests are separate to the parents. We get that. We know that they will have competing interests, in fact, sometimes. We also know that the public authorities' interests are very different from the parents, so they will be represented as well. So one thing I often say is, why on earth is it so conceptually difficult to understand that nature would have interests that need to be brought forward separate, for example, to the corporation, separate to public authorities, separate to humans as a species? Albeit I do accept that humans are part of nature and we are just another mammalian species on the planet, right? But our interests are really explicit to our species, and they won't be the same interests as an earthworm or as a owl or as a bat or as a wildflower meadow or as a colony of bees. We don't have the same interests, and in fact they may well clash. And so why is it so difficult to understand that justice requires all stakeholder voices to be heard? It's simply an add-on to what we already have. It's not conceptually difficult to process that. And once you understand that it is a procedural right, that means you are effectively creating a situation where justice is being done and seen to be done, it's not that hard a leap, really, even though it's hard to define nature itself. And of course, within nature, there will be conflicts. There's no doubt about that.
Okay. And so then, based on everything that you've shared, I assume having this awareness and understanding the gaps that exist and the need for nature, however it's defined, to have a voice, that motivated you to set up Lawyers for Nature. And so can you maybe explain a little bit about what it is you do within Lawyers for Nature then, please?
Yeah, of course. So first of all, I should say Lawyers for Nature is not just me, and I didn't set it
No.
up alone.
No.
So Paul and I, Paul Powsland is a barrister and I'm a solicitor, and we met in 2019 at a Wild Law conference, and we had a coffee, and over that coffee we were ruminating around the fact that trees have no representation in court, and nobody speaks for the trees. It was a very sort of Disney moment of nobody speaks for the trees, and a very serendipitous moment of us both coming together at the same time and saying, we don't feel that our current legal practice adequately helps the conversation move forward. We don't feel like as practicing lawyers, we're actually doing enough for the world, for the planet, for nature. And Paul said to me, I think, we should start something called Lawyers for Trees. And within about 20 minutes, I don't know, an hour, can't remember how long it was now, we both sort of went, why don't we just call it Lawyers for Nature? Because we obviously realised that rivers need help, and, even the fungi need help and things like that. So it very quickly became Lawyers for Nature in 2019. And it was Paul and I for a very long time on our own, just doing whatever we could around our full-time jobs, And Lawyers for Nature it's not a law firm, first of all. It is a collection of barristers, solicitors, and academics who come together under the banner of Lawyers for Nature to do things that would enhance the representation of nature in the world of justice, law, policy. We don't take human clients like a law firm would. So we explicitly say that we believe nature is our client and nature should be represented. That's not to say that we don't speak with human beings, because you have to. So when something's going on, you're often speaking to a human campaigner or a community group, and we will assist them in making sure that nature has a voice in whatever's going on. And that's what we do. And that can be anything. I mean, it could be helping a community group intervene in a piece of litigation in terms of, suggesting what might be in nature's best interest vis-a-vis that litigation that is already running, for example. It might be working in the policy sector where you are responding to a government consultation around biodiversity loss, and you may be suggesting what might be best for nature there. It might be running educational programs on how to actually represent nature in a planning committee or in a local community. It might be working through what an asset might look like if it was owned by nature and the community together. So, a piece of land or a section of river being owned by a community, what would that look like? How would you set that up contractually? Or as in the case that we're talking about today, it might be working with a corporation to bring the voice of nature to the board of directors, and we do that as well.
Okay. And so in terms of the evolution of perception of nature and how it's represented within law, because there's been this perception that we're separate, that humans are separate from nature, we're distinct from it. And in the West, things have been established, the culture, the systems have been established, predicated on this belief that we're somehow separate from nature. Do you see an evolution then as there's an increasing awareness and consciousness that that's just not the case, that we are a part of nature and obviously we are heavily dependent on it, that there is this desire and this understanding to create a better definition and therefore increase legal representation of it, ensure that there's a greater push for its voice outside of the organizations that you would expect to be pushing for that and expecting for that? Do you see that there's a growth and interest and understanding of what it is you're trying to achieve and why?
So there's a lot there. Let me try and
Yeah, it was a
unpack
very convoluted, rambling question.
Let me just work
yeah.
backwards from the word growth and just speak to that for a moment. The first thing I would always say to that is that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. It's not a growth in that kind of understanding. It is a reckoning with the idea that we've spent around about 150, 200 years with one of the most ridiculous narratives being forced on us, propaganda narrative, that we are somehow exceptional, that humans should be allowed to do whatever they like, that just because we have language, we should be able to rob the natural world of all value and turn it into other things that suit us. That's a narrative that's been running for in our kind of sense of our own lifetime. It seems like it's been running forever, but the reality, of course, is it hasn't at all. And we're standing on the shoulders of giants in the sense that the vast majority of humans that came before us knew that wasn't true and wouldn't work and would lead to ultimately our own downfall. I say then that there is a massive difference between commerce and capitalism. And even then, when you subdivide those two things and you understand the difference between commerce and capitalism, you can subdivide capitalism down further into different constituent parts. And the reality is that we are out of balance. The equilibrium has shifted within our lifetimes, and certainly, will continue to shift well into our children's and grandchildren's lifetimes. And I think the work that needs to be done is about addressing the imbalance there and unwinding some of the aspects of, or all of the aspects, should I say, of human exceptionalism. If you are a multi-species justice advocate, if you are an advocate for nature and nature law, you would say that justice is incomplete where nature is not represented, where particular aspects of nature are not represented in spaces which affect those parts of nature. So when you are dealing with the pollution in a river and you are meeting with stakeholders who pollute that river, you should have a voice of the river there. You should have a competent, confident voice of the river who understands the nuances of that river and the cost to all life in that river of that pollution incident or ongoing pollution. And having that voice in the room, having representation, having that procedural right to access that room, to speak, to have access to information and data, to be able to influence decisions, those are all procedural rights. And without them, that space of justice is incomplete, and possibly not just incomplete, but possibly grossly unfair and wrong and bias. So when we talk about justice being done and being seen to be done, I personally subscribe to the view that nature law must push nature representation in as many spaces as possible. Now, so that kind of brings me back to my growth question, is that if we split up what you're saying there, growth in nature representation is definitely happening, and it's definitely occurring at quite a rapid rate. And we're seeing it across multiple sectors, which I think is amazing. I don't sit here and pretend that it's perfect by any means. And sometimes growth in anything so when we talk about growth, especially when something starts to become mainstream, we have to accept that there is a huge risk of capture. There's a huge risk of misuse. Now, my view on that is that when we are making law as judges and parliamentarians and lawyers, we're making law for the masses. We're not making law for that one bad corporation that co-ops a particular movement and decides to greenwash it, right? You make law so that everybody sees the social contract and they abide by it. You are always going to find that somebody will twist something, somebody will find a loophole, somebody will do something terrible, right? That doesn't mean we don't make law at all or we don't push for nature representation. But I think we have to keep a really good eye on what's going on without stepping into that classic kind of gatekeeper role for nature representation and nature governance. Because the classic gatekeeper role effectively is just perpetuating exclusion, right? You're just saying, I'm in charge of this. I will tell you what's good and what's bad and whether you're doing things correctly. I'll tell you whether this movement can grow or not. And who am I to say that? Or who's anybody to say that, right? You just have to let it go out into the world. So I've completely forgotten what your question was, but I think it was something along the lines of, do we see the movement growing, and do we see the concept of humans recognizing that they are incredibly dependent on nature growing? I would really hope so, because the alternative is really serious destruction to the planet and to ourselves as a species. I think I would also want to mention my colleague Jessie Mondwed, who did a fantastic campaign with Frida Gormley at House of Hackney to change the definition of the Oxford English Dictionary, where they collected huge amounts of evidence from a really wide cross-section of society, asking them what they thought the word nature meant. And almost without exception, everybody said, well, of course, it includes humans in one way or another. And you can look at that work on the We Are Nature website, and you can see some of the definitions. And of course, the Oxford English Dictionary did respond really positively, and they did reinstate an obsolete definition. So Jessie did incredibly well on that to reinstate that definition.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, that's really important. It's all these little things that's trying to turn the tanker and change culture, and get us back to that point where we're acting in that way that reflects the fact that we understand that we are a part of nature and that we're dependent on it. And so the approach that you're taking is a bottom up, company by company, rewriting articles, and without waiting for Parliament. As you've said, they're slow moving, but there is a need for things to grow both bottom up and top down. And you've described company law as a way of to circumvent government and tell a news story about nature. And one of the ways that you're doing that within Lawyers for Nature is ensuring that nature has representation on the board of companies, which is also obviously addressing one of the most destructive elements of Western industrialized culture, which is capitalism, that's wreaking havoc. So could you maybe explain a little bit about what that means in terms of having nature represented on the board and why you've chosen that approach to go from company to company and do that bottom-up approach rather than trying to lobby for legislation, like devoting time and energy to that top-down approach, and getting those laws passed that will impact the masses, more broadly speaking?
So, well, first of all, I should just say that at Lawyers for Nature, we actually, despite appearances, we would say that we're not actually ideological. So we would say that if nature needs protecting, you should use every tool, every trick in the box. And what I mean by that is, although when I say despite appearances, we're very clear that we do believe a rights of nature approach as a philosophy is incredibly useful. It's incredibly useful at retelling a new story. It's incredibly useful at anchoring nature representation into certain rights. So there's definitely an incredible usefulness to that kind of philosophy. However, we describe ourselves as nature lawyers, and nature law is a category that we are literally inventing as we go along in our workplace. And nature law is different to environmental law, and it's different to corporate law, and it's different to property law. It is a unique space in which lawyers, activists, artists, writers, podcasters exist. And within that space, you have to use every tool open to you. Having said that, top-down approaches will rarely work. And that is because, generally speaking, nature is a community-based thing. So yes, of course, there are national parks, there are huge rivers which run through several cities, but generally speaking, the decision to destroy a piece of nature occurs very much at a local level. And you will see when you go into communities, you will see that they really do understand their own community, that they get why that thing should continue to exist. They understand the species that exist on it. They've walked it for many, many years. They've watched it. They've photographed it. And so imposing a top down approach on a community, it generally creates a level of mistrust or suspicion around what you're trying to do. And is it just more bureaucratic regulation, more unelected or sometimes elected officials, civil servants just telling us what to do, lots of consultants being paid a huge amount of money, and actually the thing doesn't get any better? Having said that, there are parts of the legislative system that could work quite well if it's done correctly, if it's bespoke, if it's realistic, if it's achievable within the current system and it's quick. You could actually create legislation, particularly for rivers, for example. So, one of the things we're working on at work at the moment is looking specifically at a bill to give rivers legal standing to appear in court, even if they can't have their rights upheld in court. We believe that our bill, which is, the Rivers Standing Bill, would essentially at least be able to bring the genuine voice of the river into court. So there is definitely an option for top-down legislation, but it needs to be the policy decisions behind it need to be really carefully worked through. And by that, I mean they need to be worked through with communities. So if you are legislating for a specific thing, you need to spend a lot of time in communities working out what would work for them and whether national legislation is the right thing. Now, I know because you've mentioned it to me, but we also work with local councils and we've worked with the National Infrastructure Commission for Wales. And so I do believe in those situations, for example, with Maidstone, we helped them with their rights of nature approach last October, and that was recently voted through and is now being put into place just literally a month or so ago. They voted that through. Maidstone Borough Council essentially created a council-wide rights of nature framework and agreed that all strategic spaces should abide by that rights of nature framework. So that's a really exciting move. And you could call that top down because obviously it's a body, but it's a really well thought out piece of work that really engaged the local community. It really looked hard at what things like urban street trees. What do they need? How would you manage urban street trees? What do they do for us? What can we do for them? So in many ways, that was, if it's well thought out and it's hyper localized, or at least localized, rather than this very centralized Westminster approach, which is very bureaucratic, then I would agree with that kind of thing. So that's my personal view. In terms of the other things you mentioned, generally speaking, at Lawyers for Nature, we don't actually go company to company. I think that's a bit of a myth that we just spend all our time banging on companies' doors saying you've got to have nature on the board. Our theory of change is that we do a thing at the coalface. We do a innovative thing at the coalface within the concept of nature law, and we open source all of the information as much as possible. We give as much as we possibly can to enable people to do the work themselves, or to at least use professionals who can follow our instructions. And then we just tell everyone to get on with it. We don't gatekeep, and we don't do rinse, repeat over and over again type work. It's not our theory of change. So you'll find all of our work is open source. The National Infrastructure Commission for Wales work is open sourced, as is the Faith in Nature guide, which I wrote. It's all there for you to, and of course you can download people's articles and have a look at them. But I don't spend my time doing rinse, repeat nature on the board. And I also think there's a really important reason for that is we shouldn't allow one person to do that rinse, repeat job, because it will take on the characteristics of that person's personality. And I'm a white Western qualified lawyer, and that will mean that I have certain aspects to my personality which won't be the same as another type of person, professional, artist, anything. And who am I to say, every nature on the board should look like this, right? If you open your doors and you allow stakeholders to come in and you allow them to speak, brilliant. I'm championing that for you. If you write to Companies House and say, we've appointed a nature director to our board and they're going to attend all these meetings and they're going to be allowed to see all our information, great. That's brilliant. That's wonderful. If you want to sponsor your entire employee workforce to, every single Friday to leave the work buildings and go out into local nature and repair, replenish, replace, brilliant. I mean, that's nature connected work. You are paying for them to be there for that day every single week. And I know, House of Hackney, for example, do that every Friday. They really encourage, it's a 4-day week. Day 5 is meant to be spent in nature if you want to, if you can. And I think that's great as well. So, I do not believe that anyone should set about gatekeeping nature on the board. I think that it is probably the worst kind of co-option that I could imagine. I think that it is elitist, and I think that it is a mistake in that you enforce a particular standard, which once you've met that, everything's fine. But it's not going to be fine, is it? We know that. So nature on the board is a very, very long-term systems change, and it requires a huge mindset shift within the corporation, within not just the leaders of the corporation, but it requires mindset shift throughout the corporation. It requires a huge amount of listening, and a huge amount of flinging your doors open and saying, come in, see what we're up to, which corporations historically don't really like doing, because they believe that doing that will affect their competitiveness and will give away, super top secret stuff that nobody should know. Well, why not? Why not let nature in, see what happens? In terms of, I think you might have said to me what actually happens. In order to answer that question, I would just first caveat it with saying we get asked that question a lot. And obviously I sat on the board at Faith in Nature for 2 years, and I sat on the board at House of Hackney for 1.5 years. And I've also assisted with a bunch of other stuff as well. I have to caveat the answer to that question with nothing big happens. And
Okay.
there's a really good reason for saying that. If something big happens, a la Mike off Suits, running in, flashing a piece of paper saying, "Stop press, this terrible thing's about to happen and I'm going to vote against it." If that happens, then the nature guardian, the nature director, whatever you end up calling that person, effectively, I would suspect has failed in their role somehow. There's been a point of failure within their role. And what I mean by that is that the vast majority of human interactions, despite what Suits, programs like Suits might have you think, the vast majority of human interactions are careful and graceful, and they evolve over a series of conversations and a series of action points. Even if you're talking about a court, it is very rare, certainly in the West, it's very rare for somebody to run into court with a final piece of evidence that's the silver bullet and stop proceedings and the judge just bangs a hammer. Just doesn't happen. So even litigation proceedings are incredibly slow, deliberate. They're very carefully managed, and a company's no different to that. You are coming up with a light bulb idea. Let's do this thing. Um, in a corporation, generally speaking, you're going to have to explain how that's going to create value. And the nature director's role is to say, yes, that may create value, but let's also look at the flip side of that coin. And let's also look at what might happen if we take this particular course of action, as opposed to course of action B or C or D. Or in fact, course of action Z that nobody's even thought about yet, because nobody's got their eye on the interests of nature. And that light bulb moment then develops over the course of 3, 4, 6 months, maybe 12 months, maybe 18 months. And more people are dragged into meetings and there's more reports written. And eventually you might see it go to the board of directors, who have overall governance and oversight. In our system, they have oversight of shareholder funds. So the role of the directors is to steward shareholder funds, so shareholder capital, and to pay debts as they fall due and make sure that that is an ongoing, healthy situation, that your creditors are paid as and when they demand their money is returned to them. Those are the things that the directors have to do. Anything else is not required by legislation. So you can point to the Companies Act, you can point to a Section 172 of the Companies Act. There is nothing in the Companies Act other than those things. That's what a director has to do. So when you say, is there a big showdown in the board? There really shouldn't be, because if there is, then you've got some really problematic personalities coming to that board, right? And they're probably very dramatic people. So you might say, well, is there any point to it? Well, okay, then let's say there's no point to it whatsoever. Why not do it? Why not have it there? It probably isn't going to cost a fortune. You're probably going to have to pay someone a non-executive director salary for maybe 15, 20, 25,000 pounds a year. Okay, well, you're a multi-million pound company. Just pay it. Let's see what happens. Why not? If that's your view that it won't change anything. But what about if it does change something? What about if right from the very first flitter of that idea, nature is present? Nature has a nature related matters meeting with that person. Maybe they're a middle manager, and they talk through lots of different ways in which this thing could be done differently, which means that that nature is in some way represented in ways that, there's less harm, or no harm ideally, or in what we're now working towards is nature positivity, which is where not only are you not doing any harm, or there's an offset of harm, but actually from a particular baseline you are uplifting the interests of nature. And if we could get massive corporations to the point at which they are actually benefiting nature in a circular way, and they know all of the data, and they know what is the worst thing they can do, what is the least worst thing they can do, and what is the most positive things they can do, and everybody just started doing the positive things. And we haven't got time to go into what that might look like, but how would the world look? How would human contentedness look? How would food systems look? How would water and clean water systems look, and clean air systems look? And yeah, I'm not going to beat around the bush. we might have to stop producing certain things because they are absolutely crap. Am I allowed to swear?
Yep. Yep.
You know, they're terrible. They are absolutely terrible. They don't bring any human joy or human contentedness. They don't bring any good things to nature or our cousins in the other creatures in the world. They create huge amounts of destruction and huge amounts of waste. And yeah, for the sake of what? A little bit of convenience in 2-minute convenience, then yeah, we might have to stop producing those things. That's the reality we need to face up to pretty quickly.
Your approach seems to be try something, see how it works, and most likely refine that, but then open source it, share it with everybody else, so then it can be replicated by others. You're not acting as gatekeepers and trying to become the only people who carry this approach out. And so that means there's inevitably this constant evolution as you're experimenting, as you're trying different things, and you're seeing where gaps exist and where you can play a constructive, positive role in addressing that, in line with your theory of change. So, with that in mind, and obviously you've touched upon being nature positive. So, what is the next step? What do you see? What's the direction you're going in now? What are you experimenting with now?
Well, just thinking what I can tell you, where we're up to in
Right.
certain
Okay.
things.
Right.
I think anybody that knows Lawyers for Nature knows we're always up to something.
Mhm.
Whether that makes the press or not, I can't tell you. So as I said, our theory of change is that we take risks. We love a experimental situation. We love finding a willing victim who is prepared to do something a little bit out of the ordinary. Most recently, and I think I can talk about this because I think it's all gone to press now, but most recently we were working with Phil Tovey, who is a wonderful, wonderful scientist, ex-military scientist, who is looking at systemic risk and realized that risk models entirely focus on humans. So, you know, when you are looking at risks, you are saying, what will this do to us? How will we suffer? Who will suffer within the human community? And he created a project called Risks Beyond Human Eyes, which is a very cool thing where he went into a community in Somerset and he gathered community members who were willing to experience the world as more than human, non-human species, and who were also existing along a river. So it's the River Tone in Somerset, and together they identified 5 key species. So I won't be able to name them all, but the earthworm, for example, the kestrel, the Atlantic salmon, and a few others, the deer. And he asked the community members to genuinely try and behave as if they were that animal, or at least use their senses, their human senses, to try and understand what the risks those animals were facing beyond the kind of standard risk matrix for humans. Anyway, that project ran for the last 6 months, and we were invited to come into that project as Lawyers for Nature. And the idea for us was that when value is created, that value is often attributed to some human beings. So even within the human community, as we well know, value generation is not equally split between all humans. There are incredibly poor groups of humans and incredibly rich groups of humans. And that is because value is generated and then it's collected by the wealthy and the powerful, and it's reused to create more money, to create more value and more power. And so one of the things we need to do as humans is that when value is created, justice would demand that that value is spread across those who genuinely created that value, or who need to benefit from that value because they're already disadvantaged in some way. And we really need to do that in the human community. But of course, as a nature lawyer, my role is also to suggest that that is done for nature as well. So value is equally shared with the things within nature that have contributed to that. And so Phil approached us and said, would you like to see if you can design something that would legally attribute value to the river and to the 5 animals that have been working on this project, as opposed to the contracting parties who were sponsoring the project and working within the project. So Phil works for ASRA, um, so it's the Accelerator for Systemic Risk, and the University of West England were involved, and another organisation as well. And so this is quite serendipitous, but I was sitting in my garden. I've got a very beautiful garden in East Sussex, and I do have a lot of wild rabbits that pop in now and again and just sort of, say hi. And I was just sitting in my garden having a cup of tea thinking, I wonder if you could attribute value to a river. I wonder if you could use intellectual property law to attribute value to a river and then to feed back any further value generation to that river or to those animals. And the rabbit's ears just flopped in front of me, just came across my line of vision. And just the word ecological attribution rights just popped into my head. And I was like, oh, the acronym for that is EARS, which was so serendipitous. And it sort of all happened in a train of thought all at once. And I thought, I wonder if I could create a particular right for nature called ecological attribution rights, which essentially, wherever you create value which can be attributed to nature, you could then willingly, voluntarily assert that nature has ecological attribution rights.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did. And we wrote a report, and Phil is working through it, and the other organisations are working through it. And we have suggested that, a bit like what we were talking about earlier, actually, that there is quite a lot of white space within the photograph, for intellectual property, for value creation. No one could stop you. No one could stop you saying, I hereby attribute this value to nature, which is quite exciting. You may, of course, I'm not naive here, you may, of course, find yourself unable to register it with the regulatory body that says we hold these, a register of these rights or whatever. But okay, then that's fine. But that's a regulatory issue. It's not a legal or philosophical issue. It is a regulatory issue whereby if somebody wants to steal those ecological attribution rights, those ears, if somebody wants to steal them, then they wouldn't be on a centralized register somewhere, so they could be stolen. That doesn't mean to say you shouldn't create them in the first place, right? So this is the piece of work I've been doing for the last couple of months, is theorizing and then creating legal instruments that would allow somebody to acknowledge an ecological attribution right, an ears, an ear. I can't quite work out the plurality, the grammar of ears, but it would allow you to recognize an ecological attribution right, and then with using contract law, consensually, it would allow you to encourage all parties to recognize and to uphold that right. And so you have, going right back full circle to the beginning of our chat, you have a rights holder, i.e. the river, who has created value, i.e. a database, information, stuff that can be bought and sold, ecological monitoring stuff. The river has helped, if not entirely created it, certainly helped create it. So you have a rights holder who's created value, and now you have a rights upholder within the contract who recognises that right and will uphold as best they possibly can the ecological attribution right. And I think that's quite cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. Sounds incredible. And yeah, I really hope there is significant uptake and it spreads. Yep.
Yeah. And I have to say, I think the more you enter into the world of nature law, the more humans you come across who are absolutely phenomenal.
Mm.
And I think we need to really uplift those people and really say, look, whatever we've been doing for the last 150 years or so, it really is not, it's not working. And we're not talking about tearing the whole system down overnight. That's not who I am. It's not what I believe in. I think that would leave people really seriously in trouble. But I do think that we need to find people who can tell new stories and really uplift them and really give them time and effort and money and bring them into a spotlight to say, look, this could be a whole different way of doing things. And I think that it's hard. Don't get me wrong. It's hard to do that in a system where the current narrative is growth at all costs. multinationals controlling so many different facets of society, such as the media, the economy, the fuel. But every time you say, actually, I'm going to voluntarily recognize these rights for nature, whether there be ears or anything else, you're doing a small thing that says, I am prepared to tell a different story, and I see what the work you're doing there, and I want to uplift it. And I think that's one of the ways we can get through this together.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I want this podcast and the work that I'm doing with changing the narrative to be about is helping to share the voices of those people who are on the front line and doing this work and trying to change culture, change systems, change the narrative. And I'm very conscious of time, and I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. And there's so many questions. Well, as you saw, I had so many questions, but they've just gone out the window. But yeah, like there's so much more that I would love to ask and discuss with you. But just to wrap up, then, if for the general listener, if they were to take just one thing away from the work that you're doing, what would you want that to be?
Ooh, that's quite a tricky one. I think today the message I would say would be there's never one answer, but there is always an answer. So even if you think the thing you're trying to do is really incredibly small, do it anyway. Especially if it doesn't cost you anything, especially if it doesn't change your life in difficult ways, do it anyway. Why not? Because it might feed the narrative further down the stream, and you might find someone else does a much bigger thing. So yeah, there's that's what I would say. There's always an answer. There's always a way forward. There's always a story to tell, and there's always more work to do. So keep getting up and carrying on and doing it.
Absolutely. That's a brilliant way to wrap things up. And thank you so much for your time and for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
No problem. It's lovely to spend time with you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Everything Brontie and I discussed is in the show notes, and you'll find this episode in the full archive at content.changingthenarrative.media, where you can also become a member and sign up for the newsletter. Please share, comment, and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast so more people can learn about the alternative ways we can build our systems. If you would like to support the podcast and Changing the Narrative, then please consider becoming a paying member. New episodes of the Changing the Narrative podcast are available every second Tuesday. Thanks for listening.